Daily Planet, an environmental email newsletter. She's also a professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and the former senior director of ocean policy at the National Geographic Society. And previously she served as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense, and before that was Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where she led efforts on Arctic conservation. Welcome to Background Briefing, Monia Medinia.
Thanks so much for having me.
So thanks for joining us, Monia. And I must say this display of Trumpian diplomacy, if that's not an oxymoron, with the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo turning the somewhat peaceful Arctic Council summit in Finland, where the Arctic nations, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the US had gathered. There was a lot of talk, in terms of sort of militarized talk about big power contests. In China, of course, was there as an observer. But the surreal part of it was that the US delegation was forbidden from mentioning the word global warming, and the phrase global warming, the U.S. delegation balked at its inclusion in the final communique to the point where the Arctic Council failed to produce a declaration, the first time since 1996. So essentially what Pompeo was arguing was that there's a great economic opportunity because of the ice is melting, and therefore oil extraction and mineral extraction is easier. But he refused to even talk about why this was happening. He was happy to talk about, let's go after the resources, but not why these resources were being made accessible by global warming.
It's preposterous and really an embarrassment for the U.S. to have been a leader in this forum, the Arctic Council, working hard to foster environmental and scientific cooperation among the group and to slow efforts to develop in the Arctic in order to understand it better, particularly in the face of all this change. And Pompeo just came in like a skunk in a garden party and really roiled the whole meeting and years of work and cooperation among the Arctic nations, and gave China a chance to actually throw it back in our face and say that they're the ones who recognize that climate change is a threat, and we're the ones who walked away from the Paris Agreement. So I think it actually even backfired. His own intended purpose was foiled by the ridiculousness of the position that we took.
But Pompeo also went after Canada over the Northwest Passage. That's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, why is the U.S. contesting the Northwest Passage with Canada over its sovereign rights? Clearly, it's right there above the northern coast of Canada, is it not?
Well, it is. The U.S. has contested that for a long time, and I am not surprised that he took a hardline position on that, because he took a hardline position on everything rather than being diplomatic. And it's just a shame for this particular organization, which has always been a source of cooperation and a place where things like the Northwest Passage could at least be discussed in and continued diplomacy and diplomatic efforts to resolve those disputes could happen. So it's really a big step backwards. I mean, last year there was a momentous agreement, a really unprecedented agreement among all the Arctic nations not to fish commercially in the international waters of the Arctic Ocean, and instead to cooperate on science. The U.S. led that effort, and Pompeo and the performance of the U.S. at this year's meeting just flies completely in the face of our previous efforts, which had spanned multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican, to cooperate in the Arctic Council, as opposed to being combative and using this as sort of a bully pulpit to push our way into sort of Arctic militarization and aggression, where we really are, kind of all wet, if you will. We don't have the kind of infrastructure and the kind of commitment to Arctic development that these other countries do. We don't have icebreakers. We don't have a port. We really have not acted as if we were an Arctic nation, other than in bodies like this one where we were cooperative.
And again, I'm speaking with Monia Medinia, who's the founder and publisher of Our Daily Planet, an environmental email newsletter. She's also a professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and the former senior director of ocean policy at the National Geographic Society. Previously, she served as special assistant to the Secretary of Defense, and before that was a principal deputy undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where she led efforts on Arctic conservation. So it's a bit, again, I don't know whether, it's Trumpian or it is a requisite of being in the Trump administration that you have to act like Trump, which is what Pompeo is doing, and being sort of belligerent. It's sort of my way or the highway. But Trump is often beaten up on NATO and never really enunciated the Article 5 part of NATO, which was invoked by the NATO allies when they came to U.S. help in Afghanistan, but he's never really enunciated. That's made NATO members quite nervous, and it's been a gift to Putin. But the idea that we'd have the bull in the china shop in terms of Pompeo at this Arctic conference, where Canada, Denmark, and Norway are all NATO members, and again, we're just being driven by this administration between us and our allies.
The secretary is probably the most sort of extreme in his views on climate change in the national security team, even in this administration, and that was clear by the way he conducted himself during the meeting. And indeed, it looked like he was sort of playing to the boss, trying to impress President Trump. And it's such a shame because it did both roil this particular body. It did upset the work of years and years of previous administrations to be a leader within the Arctic Council and to use this particular body as a place for cooperation and diplomacy. Even in the most difficult times with Russia and the Ukraine, the Arctic Council continued to be a place where scientific cooperation on safety in the Arctic was a consistent place for those conversations and that diplomatic outreach to continue. And now this, it's a shame, and I do think it will have repercussions in other forums like NATO.
But when you say, Monia Medinia, that Secretary of State Pompeo is pleasing his boss, Trump, by being such an outspoken denier of global warming, and he refused to have the U.S. delegation even talk about it and wanted its mention to be removed from the final communique to the point where there was no final communique, you could also make the argument that he was also pleasing his other boss, which is the Koch brothers. He's a protege of the Koch brothers. They financed his political career.
Yeah, the irony of it is that the U.S. is now unable to do the oil and gas exploration in the Arctic that the Trump administration so touted at the beginning. A federal judge has put the kibosh on that, and in addition, it was becoming infeasible for the one project that the Trump administration had given the go-ahead to for exploration in the Arctic Ocean off the north slope of Alaska. The project was failing because the permafrost is melting so quickly there. The construction needed couldn't be done because the permafrost, the actual ice bridge that was to connect the land to the drilling site, was melting underneath the drill rigs, and so that had to be suspended. And then the judge put a halt to the whole program. It's ironic, to say the least.
So there was a book written some time back called Global Warring by Clea Pascal, a Canadian analyst, and it made the case that this may well be a huge flashpoint in the future as global warming reduces the ice sheets and the Northwest Passage becomes an issue, which it already is, and it was certainly exacerbated at this Arctic Council meeting by Pompeo, who turned on the Canadians, and they're extremely upset. So do you see this? And Russia is, by the way, militarizing its north. Not that it hasn't always, with big bases in Murmansk, etc. But you were mentioning earlier they have icebreakers and we don't have. So, God forbid, is there going to be an arms race in the Arctic?
I certainly hope not, but, the Arctic Council was a place where the kind of cooperation that would keep that from happening was going on, and it's just a shame. And on top of that, the U.S. is not a member of the Law of the Sea Convention, which is yet another forum for peacefully resolving disputes like the Northwest Passage or oil and gas rights in the Arctic or fishing rights or any of the other competing demands on Arctic resources and space. And we have not acceded to that treaty. We are alone among the Arctic nations not having acceded to the treaty. And again, that puts us in a bad spot. It puts us in a bad position in terms of asserting U.S. rights and in terms of resolving disputes and being a part of the resolution of those disputes. And the Arctic is a small, closed-in area. Those countries all have to work together, and as long as the U.S. is not seen as a cooperating government in that body, it will put the U.S. in a bad spot for whatever purpose, whether it's conservation or development.
And how long can the U.S. deny global warming on the world stage like this? It is sort of surreal to have our Secretary of State talking about the great opportunities that the results of global warming are presenting to the exploitation of oil and minerals in the Arctic, but not wanting to even mention why the ice is melting.
Well, it's laughable. It flies in the face of all the facts and the latest scientific evidence of melting in Greenland and lack of sea ice in the Bering Strait. The overwhelming evidence of rapid change in the Arctic is it's hard for the U.S. to even say these things. I can't imagine some of the diplomats, the career diplomats who work in this forum, how they must have struggled to try to keep their wits about them in a meeting where the Secretary of State was saying such ridiculous and insisting on such ridiculous positions.
So is that his West Point training or something? Is this... I mean, I understand he's compromised in the sense that he's a protege of the Koch brothers. And the other way that he's compromised, at least to my mind, is that he is a believer in the rapture, in this fundamentalist version of the Book of Revelations that means that the faithful people of his religion will be all raptured up and that Israel will begin the countdown for the end of the world. And that is why people support Israel on the religious right, not because they like the Israelis necessarily, but because they need them to precipitate Armageddon. Now, to my mind, that is spiritual pornography. It's insane. But when you have the two of the three top stewards of our national security, Mike Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, believing in the rapture, isn't that a fundamental conflict of interest? You cannot be a steward of our national security and have an investment in the end of the world.
Boy, I don't know exactly how to comment on that one, Ian. I just can only say that I think the Secretary of State, in thinking that climate change is 100 years off, some distant event that we can ignore for now, seems to be, it flies in the face of all the evidence. And I honestly, I can't understand how he could possibly take that position. It puts him alone among the national security advisors. None of the others have gone that far in their position, sort of denying climate.
Well, Monia Medinia, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ian, for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Monia Medinia, who's the founder and publisher of Our Daily Planet, an environmental email newsletter. She's also an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and the former senior director of ocean policy at the National Geographic Society. And previously she served as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense, and before that was Principal Deputy Undersecretary